Don't get in. The words came out of nowhere, sharp and urgent, slicing through the steady rhythm of rain against the pavement as Claire Bennett stepped out of the restaurant's back in trance, her breath catching in her throat before she even understood why she was moving, why her pulse had suddenly begun to hammer like something inside her was trying to warn her. And across the dimly lit street, beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp, a man in a dark overcoat was reaching for the handle of a black sedan. His posture controlled, deliberate, the kind of presence that made everything around him feel quieter, heavier, as if the world itself adjusted to his gravity. And Claire didn't know his name, didn't know his story, didn't know why the sight of that single moment made something twist violently inside her chest. But she knew. She knew with a certainty that made no sense, that if he opened that door, something terrible would happen. And so she ran. Her shoes slipped slightly on the wet concrete, her apron still tied loosely around her waist, strands of damp hair clinging to her face as she crossed the distance between them in seconds that felt like they stretched too long, like time was resisting her. And just as his fingers curled around the cold metal handle, she grabbed his sleeve with both hands and pulled hard, her voice breaking through the night, louder than she thought she could ever shout. Don't get in. For a fraction of a second, everything held still, the man turning toward her with a look that was more surprise than anger, his eyes sharp and assessing, gray like steel under the dim light. And then the world shifted. The car behind him gave a low, unnatural sound, not loud, not explosive in the way movies would show, but wrong, deeply wrong, followed by a sudden burst of heat and light that surged outward, a wave of force that made the air itself shudder. And Claire stumbled backward, her grip tightening instinctively as she pulled him further away, the brightness reflecting in her wide eyes as fragments scattered across the street, glass catching the light like falling stars before clattering harmlessly against the pavement. And for a moment, there was only ringing in her ears, a hollow silence that swallowed everything else. She hit the ground harder than she expected, her palms scraping against rough concrete, breath knocked from her lungs. But she didn't let go, her fingers still locked around his sleeve as if releasing him now would somehow undo what had just happened. And when the sound finally rushed back in, voices shouting, footsteps pounding, the sharp commands of men who moved too fast and too precisely to be anything ordinary, Claire realized she was no longer just a waitress who had stepped outside for air. Hands grabbed her shoulders, pulling her away, forcing her down, and instinctively she tried to explain, words tumbling over each other. I didn't. Something was wrong. But the men surrounding her weren't listening, their focus sharp, controlled, weapons drawn not with panic but with practiced ease, their attention flickering between her and the wreck of the car as if both were equally dangerous, equally important. And fear rose in her throat, cold and immediate, because she understood, in that instant, that she had stepped into something she couldn't see, something far bigger than a single moment on a rainy night. Then his voice cut through everything. Calm. Low. Absolute. Let her go. The hands on her shoulders hesitated, then loosened, and Claire looked up, her vision still blurred at the edges, to find him standing just a few feet away, untouched, composed in a way that didn't make sense after what had just happened, his coat slightly disheveled but his presence intact, as if the chaos had rearranged itself around him instead of through him. And he was looking at her now, not with anger, not even with suspicion, but with something far more unsettling, interest. You pulled me back, he said, his voice quieter now, meant only for her, yet it carried the weight of something she couldn't fully understand. And Claire swallowed, her throat dry despite the rain, nodding once because it was the only thing she could do. Why? The question should have been simple, but it wasn't, because she didn't have an answer that made sense, didn't have a reason she could explain without sounding irrational. And yet she forced herself to speak, her voice trembling but steady enough. I saw something, it just felt wrong. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze searching her face as if measuring every flicker of fear, every trace of honesty, and the world seemed to hold its breath again, the rain softening into a quiet backdrop against the tension that stretched between them. And then he exhaled slowly, a subtle shift that seemed to ripple through the men around him, changing the air in a way Claire couldn't define. You shouldn't have seen anything, he said, not as an accusation, but as a fact. and something in the way he said it made her chest tighten, because it sounded less like a statement and more like a warning. She pushed herself up slightly, wincing at the sting in her hands, her mind racing now, trying to catch up to what had just happened, to what she had just done, and to who exactly this man was that everyone else seemed to orbit around with such quiet obedience. "I didn't mean to get involved," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them, and for the first time, something almost like amusement flickered across his expression, brief and controlled, but unmistakable. "You already are." The simplicity of it landed heavier than anything else that night, heavier than the sound, the light, the sudden surge of fear that still hadn't fully settled, and Claire felt it in the way her stomach dropped, in the way her fingers tightened against the damp pavement, as if grounding herself was the only way to stay steady. Sirens began to echo in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, and the men around him shifted slightly, their attention dividing between the approaching noise and the street. But he didn't move, his focus still fixed on her, as if the rest of the world had faded into something secondary. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, just for a second, because giving her name suddenly felt like crossing another line she couldn't step back from. But something in his gaze, steady, unyielding, yet not unkind, made it impossible to lie. "Claire," she said softly. He nodded once, as if filing it away, as if it mattered. "Claire," he repeated, and the way he said it made it sound different, heavier, like it carried more weight than it should. Then he extended a hand, not commanding, not forceful, just there, waiting, and after a moment, she placed her trembling fingers in his, the contact warm and steady against the chill of the rain. "You just saved my life," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, and for a brief, impossible moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The noise, the flashing lights beginning to appear at the end of the street, the tension in the air, and all that remained was the quiet certainty in his words. Then his grip tightened slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to hold her attention completely. "Which means whoever wanted me dead," he continued, his gaze darkening in a way that sent a chill down her spine, "now knows you exist." Claire's breath caught, the full meaning of that settling slowly, heavily, and as the sirens drew closer and the lights began to wash over the street in flashes of red and blue, she realized with a sinking clarity that the moment she had reached out and pulled him back, she hadn't just changed his fate. She had changed her own. The flashing lights painted the rain in streaks of red and blue, turning the quiet street into something unreal, something distant, as if Claire Bennett were standing inside a memory instead of her own life. And she could still feel the warmth of Adrian Vale's hand around hers even after he let go, the echo of his words settling deeper with every passing second, because whoever had tried to reach him had not stopped, and now they knew she existed, and that realization did not arrive all at once, but unfolded slowly, like a shadow stretching across the ground, creeping into every corner of her thoughts until there was nowhere left to hide from it. "You need to come with me." His voice was steady, not raised, not urgent, yet it carried a weight that made refusal feel impossible, and Claire looked up at him, rain clinging to her lashes, her breath still uneven as the world continued to move too fast around her, men speaking in low, controlled tones, the distant sound of approaching vehicles growing louder, closer, and for a moment she wanted to say no, wanted to step back into the life she understood, into the small, predictable world of late shifts and quiet mornings and bills that came like clockwork, but that world no longer existed in the same way, not after what had just happened. "I cannot just leave," she said, her voice quieter now, the edge of defiance softened by uncertainty, and his gaze did not waver as he answered, "You already have." It was not a threat, not exactly, but it was not comfort either, and Claire felt something inside her chest tighten as she realized that the line she had crossed could not be undone simply by stepping back over it. The sirens were closer now, loud enough to fill the space between them, and one of the men at Adrian's side leaned in slightly, speaking in a low voice that Claire could not fully hear, something about time, about exposure, about leaving before questions were asked that could not be answered, and Adrian gave a small nod, the decision made in a single, controlled movement before his attention returned to her. "If you stay here, you will be questioned," he said, his tone even, almost matter of fact, And if you are questioned, your name will be recorded. And if your name is recorded, it will not stay hidden for long. Each word landed with quiet precision, not rushed, not dramatic, just undeniable. And Claire swallowed, her mind racing through possibilities she did not fully understand, consequences she could not fully see, but the pattern was clear enough to follow. And for the first time, fear shifted into something sharper, something more focused. "And if I go with you?" she asked, the question leaving her before she could stop it. And for a moment, something flickered in his expression again, that same brief hint of something almost human beneath the control. "Then you stay alive long enough for me to find out who did this." The simplicity of it should not have been reassuring, and yet it was, not because it promised safety, but because it promised direction. And in a night that had already fractured everything she understood, direction was something she could hold on to. He did not wait for her answer after that, not in the way people usually did, not with hesitation or persuasion, but with certainty, turning slightly as if the choice had already been made. And for a heartbeat, Claire stood frozen, caught between two versions of herself, the one who would walk away and pretend none of this had happened, and the one who would follow a man she did not know into a world she had never imagined. And the distance between those two versions felt impossibly wide until she took a step forward. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but it changed everything, and the men around him shifted immediately, forming a quiet perimeter as they guided them toward another vehicle that had pulled up without Claire even noticing, its presence as controlled and deliberate as everything else about him. And as the door opened, she hesitated again, just for a second, her reflection catching in the dark glass, rain streaking across the surface, her expression unfamiliar to her own eyes, not because she had changed, but because something inside her had been forced to wake up too quickly. "Claire." His voice drew her back, softer this time, not commanding, not distant, and when she looked at him, she saw it more clearly, the faint trace of something behind the control, something that did not belong to the version of him the world knew, and it steadied her in a way she did not expect. She nodded once, more to herself than to him, and stepped inside. The door closed with a quiet finality that seemed louder than the sirens, louder than the rain, and as the vehicle began to move, smooth and controlled, pulling away from the chaos without hesitation, Claire pressed her hands together in her lap, fingers still trembling slightly, the events of the night replaying in fragments that refused to settle into something coherent. Across from her, Adrian sat in silence, his posture unchanged, his presence filling the space without effort, and for several seconds, neither of them spoke, the only sound the soft rhythm of rain against the windows and the distant hum of the city beyond it. "You saw something," he said at last, not looking away from her, and Claire took a breath, forcing herself to focus, to pull the scattered pieces of memory into something usable. "There was a man," she said slowly, the image forming more clearly now that she was no longer standing in the middle of the street. "He was near the car earlier, before you came out, and I remember thinking he did not belong there." Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly, not in suspicion, but in attention, and she continued, her voice steadier now as the details aligned. "He had a silver lighter, engraved. I noticed it because he kept turning it in his hand, like he was waiting for something." The car remained quiet for a moment after she finished, the weight of her words settling into the space between them, and then Adrian leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, but something had shifted again, something subtle but undeniable. "That is not a detail most people would notice," he said, not as praise, not as doubt, but as a recognition of something she had not realized about herself. And Claire felt a faint flicker of uncertainty at that, because she had never thought of herself as someone who noticed things that mattered. "I just pay attention," she said, almost apologetically, and for a brief moment, his gaze softened, not enough to change the distance between them, but enough to alter its meaning. "Good," he said quietly, "because now it matters." The city lights blurred past the windows, stretching into lines of gold and white against the dark, and Claire leaned back slightly, her heartbeat finally beginning to slow, though the tension beneath it remained, constant and unyielding. And as she watched the reflections shift across the glass, she realized that whatever waited ahead was not something she could step out of when it became too much, not something she could leave behind at the end of a shift or a long night, because this was not. a moment anymore. It was a beginning. The vehicle moved through the city like it belonged to a different world, insulated from the noise and motion outside. And Claire Bennett found herself watching the reflections of passing lights slide across the tinted glass, as if they might reveal something she was missing, something that would make sense of how quickly everything had shifted, because less than 15 minutes ago she had been standing behind a counter counting tips, and now she was sitting across from a man whose name carried weight she could feel even without fully understanding it. And the silence between them was not empty, but deliberate, controlled, like everything else about him. Adrian Vale did not look away from her for long, his gaze returning in quiet intervals, as if measuring not just her words but the spaces between them. And Claire became aware of the way she held herself, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands rested too still in her lap, as if any movement might draw attention she could not handle. But he had already seen everything that mattered, and that realization settled into her slowly, steady, and unavoidable. "Tell me exactly what you remember," he said at last, his voice low but clear, and it was not a request in the way people usually asked for details. It was an expectation, a quiet command that did not need to be repeated, and Claire took a breath, closing her eyes for just a moment to steady herself, to return to that earlier point in the evening before everything had broken open. "He was inside the restaurant first," she said carefully, her voice gaining strength as she followed the memory. "Sat near the window. But he did not eat much, he just watched the street, like he was waiting for something to happen." Adrian did not interrupt, but she could feel his attention sharpen, and it gave her something to hold on to, a reason to keep going even when the details felt small, almost insignificant. "When I went outside for a break, I saw him again," she continued, her fingers tightening slightly together as the image became clearer. "He was closer to the curb, near your car, and he kept turning that lighter in his hand, over and over, like he was counting time." The car remained steady, the motion smooth beneath them, but something in the air shifted again, subtle but present, and Claire opened her eyes, meeting Adrian's gaze as she finished. "I remember thinking it was strange, because no one else was standing that close to the car." For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the quiet stretched just long enough for Claire to wonder if she had said something wrong, if she had missed something important. But then Adrian leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, yet focused in a way that suggested he was already placing her words into a larger pattern she could not see. "You notice what others ignore," he said, not as praise, but as a conclusion, and Claire hesitated, unsure how to respond to that, because noticing had never felt like a skill. It had simply been something she did without thinking, something that had never mattered until now. "I work with people all day," she said quietly. "You start to pick up on things, small habits, the way someone looks at the door, the way they hold something in their hand." Adrian's gaze lingered on her for a second longer, and there was something different in it now, not just interest, not just calculation, but recognition of a kind he did not often show. And before Claire could fully understand what that meant, the vehicle slowed, turning smoothly onto a quieter street lined with tall buildings that seemed to rise out of the darkness like silent witnesses. The car came to a stop beneath a covered entrance, and the door opened before she could reach for it, one of the men outside offering a brief nod as if her presence was already understood, already accounted for. And Claire hesitated again, the transition from motion to stillness making everything feel more real, more immediate. But Adrian stepped out without looking back, his confidence unbroken, and after a heartbeat, she followed. The air was cooler here, the rain lighter, almost a mist, and the building in front of them did not look extraordinary at first glance, just another structure among many. But the way the doors opened without question, the way the people inside moved with quiet precision, made it clear that this place operated under rules she did not know, rules that did not need to be spoken to be followed. They entered a private elevator without stopping at a desk, without signing anything, without even exchanging more than a glance with the person who held the door, and as the elevator doors closed, sealing them inside a space that felt too quiet, too contained, Claire became acutely aware of the distance between the life she knew and the one she had just stepped into. The elevator rose smoothly, the numbers changing without sound, and Claire watched them climb, each floor taking her further away from the street, from the restaurant, from everything that had defined her world just hours ago. and when the doors finally opened again, the space beyond was nothing like she expected. It was not loud or extravagant or filled with unnecessary displays of wealth, but it carried a quiet, undeniable presence, clean lines, muted tones, large windows that looked out over the city like a distant horizon, and everything in it felt deliberate, chosen, controlled. Adrian stepped inside without hesitation, removing his coat and handing it off to someone who appeared almost instantly, and Claire lingered near the entrance for a moment, unsure where to stand, unsure what was expected of her, until his voice reached her again. "You are safe here." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her pause, because she realized he was not offering comfort. He was stating a condition, one that existed only within these walls, and the implication of that settled heavily in her chest. She stepped further inside, her shoes quiet against the polished floor, her eyes taking in the space without fully focusing on anything, and after a moment, she spoke again, the question that had been building since the car ride finally finding its way out. Who would want to do something like that? Adrian did not answer immediately, and when he finally turned toward her, the expression on his face was not cold, not distant, but something more complicated, something that suggested the answer was not simple enough to be given in a single sentence. "Someone who knows me," he said, his voice quieter now, "and someone who believes I will not see it coming." Claire felt a small, involuntary chill at that, because it meant the danger was not random, not distant, it was personal, intentional, and closer than she wanted to believe. And as she stood there, in a place that felt both safe and unfamiliar, she understood that the man she had pulled back from that car was not just someone powerful. He was someone surrounded by unseen lines, unseen threats, and now, without meaning to, she had stepped directly into the center of them. The room felt too still after his words, as if even the air had paused to consider them, and Claire Bennett stood near the edge of the wide living space, her gaze drifting toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city stretched out below in quiet patterns of light, distant and unreachable. And for the first time since she had stepped inside, the weight of everything began to settle more clearly, not in sudden panic, but in a slow, steady realization that this was not a place she could leave whenever she wanted, not until whatever had begun tonight found its end. "You said someone knows you," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, but more grounded, because the initial shock had begun to fade, replaced by something steadier, something that allowed her to think instead of just react. And Adrian Vale did not immediately answer, his attention shifting briefly toward the window before returning to her, as if measuring how much to say and how much to keep behind the quiet walls he had built around himself. "Everyone who matters knows me," he replied at last, his tone calm, but carrying a layer of meaning that made the statement feel heavier than it should, and Claire frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in understanding that his world did not follow the same rules as hers, that what counted as normal for him would never feel simple to her. "That is not what I meant," she said, taking a small step further into the room, her hands no longer held tightly together, but still careful, still aware. "You said they believe you would not see it coming. That means it is not just someone who knows your name. It is someone who knows your patterns." The words came more easily now, shaped by instinct rather than hesitation, and for a brief moment something shifted in his expression again, a flicker of acknowledgement that did not come often, as if she had stepped closer to something real, something that mattered beyond the surface of the situation. "You learn quickly," he said, and there was no mockery in it, only observation, and Claire exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as she met his gaze. "I have to," she answered, the truth of it simple and unpolished. "I do not have the luxury of ignoring things that feel wrong." The silence that followed was different from before, less tense, more deliberate, as if something between them had shifted, not enough to erase the distance, but enough to change its shape, and Adrian moved toward a low table near the center of the room, retrieving a small device and setting it down with quiet precision before speaking again. "Marcus will review the footage from the surrounding buildings," he said, not looking at her as he spoke. "If your man was there long enough, he will appear somewhere." Claire nodded, though he had not asked for agreement, her mind already returning to the image she had described, the man by the curb, the silver lighter turning again and again in his hand like a silent countdown, and a faint unease settled deeper in her chest, as she realized how easily she could picture him, how clearly the memory held. He did not look nervous, she added after a moment, her voice thoughtful now, less uncertain. Most people would, if they were waiting for something like that. But he was calm, almost patient. Adrian's gaze lifted again, sharper this time, not because the detail surprised him, but because it confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. That is because he was not waiting to act, he said quietly. He was waiting to leave. Claire felt a small chill at that, not because of the implication itself, but because of the ease with which he reached it, the way his mind moved through possibilities without hesitation, as if he had done this before, many times, and she realized then that this was not new for him, not entirely, that the danger surrounding him was not a single event, but part of a pattern she could only begin to understand. Then whoever planned it was confident, she said, more to herself than to him. But he heard it anyway, and something in his expression tightened just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for her to see now that she was paying closer attention. Confidence is often misplaced, he replied, his tone steady, though the words carried something sharper beneath them. And for a moment Claire wondered what he was thinking, what names or faces might already be forming in his mind, what history lay behind a statement that simple. A soft sound from the far side of the room drew their attention, and a man stepped forward from the hallway, his presence quiet but purposeful, his posture straight, his expression composed in a way that suggested both discipline and familiarity with the environment, and Adrian turned slightly as he approached. "Marcus," he said, the name enough to shift the atmosphere again, grounding it in something more immediate, more actionable. "We have begun pulling external feeds," Marcus replied, his voice low but clear, his eyes flicking briefly toward Claire before returning to Adrian, not dismissive, not suspicious, but aware, as if assessing her place in a situation that was still unfolding. "It will take some time to isolate the individual she described, but we have a starting point." Adrian nodded once, the motion small but decisive, and Claire felt the faintest sense of relief at that, not because the danger had lessened, but because something was being done, something was moving forward instead of circling in uncertainty. "Focus on the lighter," Adrian said, his gaze steady. "Silver, engraved. That detail will narrow the field." Marcus inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement before stepping back, already turning his attention to the task, and as he disappeared down the hallway, the room seemed to settle again, quieter but no less charged. Claire let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her gaze drifting once more toward the window, where the city lights continued their distant rhythm, unchanged by everything that had just happened, and for a moment she felt the distance between that world and this one more sharply than before. "You trust him," she said, not turning back immediately, the observation simple but intentional, and Adrian's response came without hesitation. "I trust what he does," he said, and the distinction was subtle but clear, and Claire understood it in a way that made her chest tighten slightly, because it meant trust here was not given freely, not in the way she understood it, but measured, tested, earned in ways she could not yet see. She turned back to him then, her expression more composed now, the initial shock replaced by something steadier, something that allowed her to stand in this space without feeling entirely out of place. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet resolve she had not expected to find so quickly. "Then we find him," she said, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a simple statement of intent, and Adrian held her gaze for a moment longer than before, something unreadable passing through his expression before settling into something quieter, something that felt almost like approval. "We will," he replied, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a certainty that did not leave room for doubt. And as Claire stood there, in a place that no longer felt entirely foreign, she realized that whatever had begun tonight was no longer just about surviving it. It was about understanding it, and that meant stepping further into a world she had never planned to enter, guided by a man whose life was built on shadows, and trusting that somewhere within all of it, there was a truth she could hold on to. The quiet that followed his words did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, like the calm before something else revealed itself, and Claire Bennett stood a little straighter without realizing it, her mind no longer racing in scattered fragments, but beginning to align, to connect the pieces she had been given, Because the moment she said, "Then we find him," something had shifted not only in the room but inside her, and she could feel it in the way she no longer hovered near the edges of the space. No longer unsure of where she stood, but present, aware, and unwilling to step back into uncertainty. Adrian Vale watched her in that quiet, measuring not just her words but the steadiness behind them, and for a brief moment, something in his expression softened in a way that was almost imperceptible, as if he had not expected resolve to come from someone who had been pulled into his world without warning, and yet here it was, clear and unforced. "You should rest," he said after a moment, his tone returning to its controlled calm, but there was something different beneath it now, not distance, but consideration, and Claire let out a small breath, her shoulders easing just slightly as the suggestion reached her, because only then did she realize how tired she actually was, how much her body had been holding since the moment everything changed, but she shook her head gently. "I will not be able to," she admitted, her voice quiet but honest. "Not yet." Adrian did not argue with her, which surprised her more than if he had insisted, and instead he moved toward the window, his gaze shifting briefly toward the city below before returning to her. "Then sit," he said, a simple instruction, and Claire hesitated only for a second before moving toward one of the chairs near the center of the room, lowering herself carefully, her hands resting against the fabric as if grounding herself in something real, something stable. The silence returned again, but it no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt purposeful, like both of them were waiting for the same thing without needing to say it out loud. And after a few moments, Claire spoke again, her voice softer now, but carrying a quiet determination that had not been there before. "If the person was not waiting to act, then someone else triggered it," she said, her eyes lifting to meet his, and Adrian gave a slight nod, acknowledging the direction of her thinking. "Yes," he replied, "which means at least two people were involved, possibly more." Claire leaned forward slightly, her brow furrowing as she followed the logic, her thoughts moving faster now, clearer. "Then the man with the lighter was not the one controlling it," she continued. "He was there to confirm something, to make sure you were in position." Adrian's gaze sharpened again, not in surprise, but in approval of the pattern she was tracing, and he stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing just enough to shift the tension in the room. "And if he was confirming," Adrian added, his voice low, "then he was reporting to someone who needed certainty before acting." Claire nodded slowly, the implication settling into place, heavier than before, because it meant planning, coordination, intention that extended beyond a single moment, and she exhaled quietly, her fingers tightening slightly against the arm of the chair. "Which means this was not just an attempt," she said, her voice almost a whisper now. "It was meant to succeed." The words lingered between them, and for a brief second, something darker moved through Adrian's expression, something that spoke of experience, of moments like this not being new, and Claire saw it clearly now, not just the control he carried, but the history behind it, the weight of knowing what it meant to be the target of something planned so carefully. "It was," he said simply, and there was no denial in it, no attempt to soften the truth, just a quiet acknowledgement that made the reality of the situation sharper, more defined. Before Claire could respond, the sound of footsteps approached again, measured and precise, and Marcus re-entered the room, his presence steady, his expression composed but more focused than before, as if something had shifted in the information he carried. "We have something," he said, his voice controlled but carrying a subtle urgency that had not been there earlier, and both Claire and Adrian turned toward him, the air tightening slightly with anticipation. Marcus stepped closer, holding a small tablet in his hand, the screen glowing faintly as he brought it into view, and he angled it so Adrian could see. "External cameras picked up a partial image," Marcus continued. "Not enough for a full identification yet, but the lighter is visible, and the engraving matches a custom design." Adrian's eyes moved over the screen quickly, taking in the details with a focus that seemed almost immediate, and Claire rose from her seat without thinking, stepping closer, her attention drawn to the image despite the distance she knew she should keep. "Can I see?" she asked, her voice careful, and for a moment Marcus hesitated, not out of refusal, but out of instinct, his eyes flicking briefly toward Adrian, who gave a small nod. Marcus turned the screen slightly, allowing Claire a clearer view, and she leaned in just enough to study it, her gaze narrowing as she focused on the small, distinct shape of the lighter, the engraved lines catching the light in a way that felt familiar. "That is him," she said quietly, certainty in her voice. "I remember the way he held it, like it mattered." Marcus nodded once, acknowledging her confirmation, and Adrian remained silent for a moment, his attention still on the image as if placing it within a larger map she could not see. "Track the design," Adrian said after a moment, his tone steady but decisive. "Find where it was made, who ordered it, and who has access to it." Marcus inclined his head slightly, already turning to carry out the instruction, but before he could step away, Claire spoke again, her voice cutting through the moment with a quiet urgency. "Wait," she said, and both men paused, their attention returning to her. "If it is custom," she continued, her mind moving quickly now, "then it is not just something anyone can get. It means the person wanted to be recognized, at least by someone." Adrian's gaze shifted to her again, sharper now, more focused, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow around that single realization. "Or they wanted someone else to take the blame," he said, his voice lower now, the implication settling between them like a shadow, and Claire felt a chill move through her again, not from fear this time, but from the understanding that the deeper they looked, the more complex it would become. Marcus left without another word, the task already underway, and the room returned to its quiet state once more, but it was different now, no longer uncertain, but charged with direction, with purpose, and Claire stood there, no longer at the edge of a world she did not belong to, but within it, connected to it in a way she had not chosen but could not deny. Adrian stepped closer again, not imposing, not overwhelming, but present in a way that made it impossible to ignore the shift that had taken place between them, and when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something quieter but more personal. "You changed the outcome tonight," he said, and Claire met his gaze, steady now, no longer unsure. "So did you," she replied, her voice calm, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need to be named to be understood, and as the city continued to move beyond the glass, unaware of what had begun within these walls, Claire realized that whatever came next, she was no longer just someone who had been pulled into the story. She was part of it. The moment Marcus disappeared down the hallway, the room seemed to exhale, but the tension did not fade. It simply changed shape, settling into something quieter and more focused, and Claire Bennett remained standing where she was, her eyes still fixed on the place where the image had been. The silver lighter burned into her memory with a clarity that refused to soften, because now it was no longer just a detail she had noticed. It was a thread, and she could feel it pulling everything forward. Adrian Vale did not move immediately, his attention lingering on her in a way that felt different from before, less guarded, less distant, as if something about her presence had begun to register beyond the immediate situation. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quieter weight than before. "You are not reacting like most people would," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Claire blinked slightly, the comment catching her off guard, because she had not thought about how she should be reacting, only that she needed to keep up, to understand what was happening before it moved beyond her reach. "What would most people do?" she asked, her tone neutral but curious, and Adrian's gaze held hers for a moment before he answered. "They would want to leave," he said simply. "They would want distance from something they do not understand." Claire let out a small breath, her shoulders shifting as she considered that, and for a second she thought about the restaurant, about the familiar rhythm of orders and conversations, and the quiet comfort of knowing what each hour would bring. But that image felt distant now, like something she had already stepped away from without realizing it. "I did want that," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "But wanting something does not mean it is still an option." Adrian's expression changed again, not dramatically, but enough for her to see that he understood exactly what she meant, and something in that shared understanding settled between them, subtle but real. He turned slightly then, moving toward a small bar set into the far wall, pouring a glass of water without asking before returning and handing it to her. The gesture simple, almost unexpected, and Claire accepted it with a quiet nod, her fingers brushing briefly against his as she took the glass, the contact fleeting but grounding. She took a sip, the coolness steadying her thoughts, and when she lowered the glass, her mind had already begun to move again, faster now, more focused than before. If the lighter is custom, and if it was meant to be seen, then it is not just a clue, she said slowly, her gaze lifting to meet his again. It is a message. Adrian did not respond immediately, but the way his eyes sharpened told her she was not wrong, and she continued, her voice gaining strength as the idea took shape. Not necessarily for you, she added, but for someone who would recognize it, someone who would understand what it means. Adrian exhaled quietly, a small shift that carried more weight than it should have, and he moved a step closer, his presence filling the space without overwhelming it. And what would it mean? He asked, not dismissing her, but testing the direction of her thinking, and Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, not because she doubted herself, but because she was stepping into something she could not fully see yet. It depends on who owns it, she said. But if it is unique, then it is tied to a person, not just an action. The silence that followed was heavier than before, and for a brief moment, Claire wondered if she had gone too far, if she had stepped into something she did not have the right to analyze. But Adrian's expression did not close off. It deepened, as if he was considering not just her words, but the way she reached them. Then we are not just looking for someone who planned this, he said quietly. We are looking for someone who wants to be known. Claire felt a faint chill at that, because it shifted the situation from something hidden to something deliberate, something personal, and she nodded slowly, her grip tightening slightly on the glass in her hand. Or someone who wants to send a signal, she said, and Adrian's gaze held hers again, longer this time, the distance between them narrowing in a way that felt less like tension and more like alignment. Before either of them could speak again, a soft tone sounded from across the room, subtle but clear, and Adrian turned toward it immediately, crossing the space with measured steps as he picked up the device Marcus had left behind earlier, his eyes scanning the screen quickly, and Claire watched the shift in his posture, the way his focus sharpened into something precise and controlled, and she knew before he said anything that something had changed. Marcus found a match, he said, his voice lower now, carrying a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken again, and she stepped closer without thinking, her attention fixed on him as he turned the screen slightly toward her. The design on the lighter belongs to a limited set, he continued, commissioned privately, not available commercially. Claire leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the image, the engraving clearer now, more defined, and something about it tugged at her memory in a way she could not immediately place. Who would have something like that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and Adrian's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, something darker, more personal. Someone with access, he said, someone who understands how to move without being seen. Claire straightened slightly, her mind racing again, the pieces beginning to form a pattern that was still incomplete but no longer random, and she took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay steady. And someone who knew where you would be, she added, her voice more certain now, and Adrian gave a small nod, the confirmation quiet but absolute. Yes, he said, and the single word carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it meant the threat was not distant, not external. It was close, close enough to predict his movements, close enough to plan around them, and Claire felt that realization settle deeper than anything else so far. She looked at him then, really looked, seeing not just the control he carried, but the layers beneath it, the history, the awareness, the quiet readiness that came from living in a world where trust was measured and danger was never entirely absent. And for a moment, she understood something she had not before. You have dealt with this before, she said, not as a question, but as a quiet recognition, and Adrian did not deny it, did not deflect it. He simply met her gaze and held it. Yes, he said, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper, something that did not need to be explained, and Claire nodded slowly, the understanding settling into place. This was not new for him, but it was new for her, and yet she was still here, still thinking, still choosing to stay. The realization surprised her, not because she had not noticed it before, but because she had not fully accepted it, and as she stood there, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, the quiet hum of the room surrounding them, she felt something shift again, not outside, but within, a quiet decision forming without hesitation. "Then we keep going," she said, her voice steady now, no longer uncertain, and Adrian watched her for a moment longer before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," he replied, and this time, the word felt less like a response and more like a promise. And as the night continued to unfold around them, Claire realized that whatever this was becoming, she was no longer just following it. She was moving with it. The quiet agreement between them did not linger for long, because the moment the direction was set, the room itself seemed to shift into motion again, subtle but undeniable, as if every unseen system within the space had already begun to respond, and Claire Bennett felt it in the way the air changed, in the faint hum of something activating behind the walls, in the almost imperceptible awareness that nothing here was ever truly still. Adrian Vale set the device down with deliberate precision, his gaze lingering on the screen for a fraction longer before he turned back to her. And there was something new in the way he looked at her now, not just acknowledgement, not just calculation, but a quiet inclusion, as if she was no longer standing outside the situation but within it, part of the pattern rather than an observer of it. "There is one more detail we need to consider," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying that same controlled weight that made every word feel intentional, and Claire straightened slightly, her attention sharpening immediately, because she had begun to recognize that when he spoke like that, it meant something important was about to surface. "The timing," he continued, stepping closer, his presence steady but not overwhelming. "The moment the car was approached, the moment the device was triggered, it was precise, not approximate." Claire frowned slightly, her mind already moving to follow his thought, and she nodded once, slowly. "Which means whoever triggered it knew exactly when you would reach the door," she said, her voice thoughtful, her tone steady, and Adrian's gaze held hers for a moment longer before he gave a small nod. "Yes," he said simply, "and that level of precision does not come from observation alone." The implication settled quickly, heavier than before, and Claire felt it in the way her breath slowed, in the way her thoughts narrowed into something more focused. "It comes from inside information," she said quietly, and the words did not feel like a leap. They felt like a conclusion, something that had been forming since the moment he said someone knew his patterns, and Adrian did not deny it, did not soften it. He simply accepted it with the same calm that had defined him from the beginning. "It does," he replied, and for a brief moment, something darker moved beneath the surface of his expression, something that spoke of trust measured carefully, of lines drawn long before tonight, and Claire felt a faint tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from understanding. This was not just about finding a stranger. This was about finding someone close enough to matter. The realization did not make her step back. It made her step forward, just slightly, her posture more grounded, her presence more certain. "Then the lighter is not just a signal," she said, her voice steady. "It is a misdirection, something obvious enough to draw attention away from something else." Adrian watched her closely, and for the first time since she had met him, there was no distance in his gaze, only focus, only attention, as if he was seeing not just her words, but the way she reached them. "And what would it be drawing attention away from?" he asked, not dismissing her, but pushing the thought further, and Claire paused, not because she did not have an answer, but because she wanted to be certain, wanted to follow the logic all the way through before speaking. "From whoever gave the signal," she said at last, her voice quieter now, but more certain, "from the person who did not need to be seen because they were already close enough to act." The silence that followed was not empty. It was sharp, precise, as if the entire room had narrowed around that single idea, and Adrian exhaled slowly, a subtle shift that carried more weight than any reaction could have. "Then we are not just looking outward," he said, his tone calm, but carrying a deeper edge now. "We are looking inward." Claire nodded once, the understanding settling fully into place, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the realization anchoring itself between them in a way that felt both clear and unavoidable. Before either of them could speak again, the sound of movement approached from the hallway, steady and purposeful, and Marcus re-entered, his expression more focused than before, the quiet control in his posture now paired with something closer to urgency. "We have a name connected to the commission," he said, his voice low but direct, and Adrian turned immediately, his attention locking onto him with the same precision that defined everything else about him. Who? Adrian asked, the single word carrying more weight than a full sentence, and Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness of what the answer meant. The lighter design was commissioned through a private broker, Marcus said, holding the tablet steady. But the payment trail leads back to a shell account that has been used before, one we have seen connected to internal operations. Claire felt the shift instantly, the confirmation of what they had already begun to suspect settling into something real, something tangible, and her gaze moved between them as Marcus continued. The account has been accessed recently, he added, from within one of our secure networks. The words landed heavily, but Adrian did not react outwardly, his expression remaining controlled, his posture unchanged, and yet Claire could feel the difference, the subtle tightening beneath the surface, the way his attention sharpened into something more focused, more dangerous in its clarity. Which network? Adrian asked, his tone steady, and Marcus glanced down at the screen before answering. The East Division, he said, and for the first time since she had met him, Claire saw a flicker of something that was not entirely controlled pass through Adrian's expression, something that spoke not of surprise, but of confirmation, as if a suspicion had just been given form. That narrows it, Adrian said quietly, his voice lower now, carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller, more contained, and Claire felt her pulse quicken again, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment, from the realization that they were no longer searching in the dark, they were closing in on something real. She stepped closer without thinking, her presence no longer tentative, her voice steady as she spoke. Then the person with the lighter is not the one who matters most, she said, her gaze moving to Adrian. The one who accessed that network is. Adrian looked at her then, really looked, and for a brief moment, the distance between them disappeared entirely, replaced by something quieter, something that felt like alignment, like shared understanding. Yes, he said, and the word carried more than agreement. It carried recognition, and Claire felt it settle into place, firm and unshakable. This was no longer just about what she had seen. It was about what they were about to uncover. And as the night deepened beyond the glass, the city continuing its distant rhythm, unaware of the shift taking place within these walls, Claire realized that the path ahead was no longer uncertain. It was narrowing, focusing, drawing them toward a truth that was closer than either of them had expected. The air in the room felt different now, not heavier, not lighter, but sharper, like every second carried more meaning than the last. And Claire Bennett stood close enough to feel the shift without needing it explained, her attention fixed on Adrian Vale as he absorbed the information Marcus had just delivered, the confirmation of something they had both already begun to understand settling into place with quiet certainty. The East Division. The words lingered, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, and Claire could see the way Adrian's mind moved through it, not reacting, not hesitating, but aligning pieces she could only begin to recognize. And for the first time since she had stepped into this world, she felt the distance between them narrow in a way that was not about proximity, but about perspective. Who has access? She asked, her voice steady, not interrupting, but joining the conversation with a clarity that no longer felt out of place. And Marcus glanced briefly toward her before answering, not dismissive, not surprised, simply acknowledging her presence as part of the unfolding process. Access is restricted, Marcus said, his tone controlled, but not limited to one individual. There are several key personnel within that division who operate with clearance at that level. Claire nodded slowly, absorbing the structure, the implication, the narrowing field that still held too many possibilities, and she turned her attention back to Adrian, who had not yet spoken again, his silence not empty but deliberate, the kind that carried weight without needing words. Then it is someone who understands how to stay invisible within a system that is meant to track everything, she said, her tone thoughtful, and Adrian's gaze shifted to her again, sharper now, more focused, as if the way she framed it mattered as much as the conclusion itself. Yes, he said quietly, someone who knows how to move without triggering attention. Claire exhaled slowly, her mind continuing to follow the pattern, and she stepped closer to the table where the device still rested, her fingers brushing lightly against its edge as she leaned in, not out of habit, but out of focus, out of the need to stay connected to something tangible while everything else moved beneath the surface. Then the mistake was not the action, she said after a moment, her voice lower now, more certain. It was the message. The words hung in the air, and Adrian did not respond immediately, his attention fixed on her in a way that made the silence feel intentional. And Claire continued, her thoughts forming more clearly with each step forward. If the lighter was meant to be seen, then it was not just a signal to someone else, she said. It was a statement, something that could be traced, something that could lead back. Adrian's expression shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition, and he stepped closer, his presence steady, grounding, as he considered her words. And if it leads back, he said, his voice calm but carrying a deeper edge, then it leads to someone who does not mind being found. Claire felt a small chill at that, not from fear, but from the understanding of what that meant, because someone who did not mind being found was not careless, they were deliberate, and that changed everything. Or someone who wants you to look in the wrong direction, she said quietly, her gaze lifting to meet his, and for a moment, the space between them held that idea, balanced, waiting to be tested, and Adrian nodded once, the motion small but decisive. Both are possible, he said, and both require us to be careful about what we assume. Marcus shifted slightly, his attention moving between them, and he spoke again, his voice steady but carrying the weight of urgency that had not faded since he returned. We are isolating the access logs now, he said. But if this came from within, it will not remain visible for long. Whoever accessed the network knew what they were doing. Adrian's gaze did not leave Claire's as he responded, his voice lower now, more focused. Then we move before they do, he said, and the certainty in his tone was not forceful, it was controlled, precise, the kind of decision that did not need to be repeated. Claire straightened slightly, her grip tightening for just a moment against the edge of the table before she released it, her posture steady, her presence fully anchored in the moment. If they expected you not to see it coming, she said, her voice calm, then they are already planning what comes next. Adrian held her gaze, and something in his expression shifted again, not in surprise, but in alignment, as if the rhythm of her thinking matched his own in a way he had not anticipated. They are, he said, which means we do not give them the time to adjust. The room seemed to tighten around that decision, not physically, but in focus, in direction, and Claire felt it in the way her thoughts sharpened, in the way the uncertainty that had defined the beginning of the night had been replaced by something else entirely, something more deliberate, more intentional. She moved slightly to the side, her eyes drifting briefly toward the window again, the city stretching out beyond the glass in endless lines of light, unchanged, unaware, and for a moment, she saw the contrast more clearly than before, the distance between that world and this one, the simplicity she had left behind, and the complexity she had stepped into without warning. But she did not look away for long. She turned back, her focus returning to Adrian, to the space they now shared, to the path that had formed between them not by choice, but by consequence, and when she spoke again, her voice carried no hesitation. Then we stay ahead of them, she said, and Adrian's response came without pause. We do, he replied, and the words did not feel like a plan. They felt like a direction already in motion, already unfolding. Marcus nodded once, the acknowledgement brief but clear, and stepped back again, his attention returning to the work that would turn information into action, and as he disappeared once more into the quiet structure of the space, the room settled into a new kind of stillness, not empty, not waiting, but ready. Claire stood there for a moment longer, her breathing steady, her thoughts aligned, and she realized that whatever fear had been there before had not disappeared. It had transformed, reshaped into something more useful, something that allowed her to stand in this moment without being overwhelmed by it. Adrian moved past her then, not brushing against her, not breaking the space between them, but close enough for her to feel the shift in his presence, the quiet gravity that defined everything he did, and he paused near the window, his gaze lifting briefly to the city beyond before returning inward, focused, controlled, certain. This does not end tonight, he said, not looking at her, but speaking in a way that made it clear the words were meant for both of them. And Claire nodded, even though he could not see it, because she understood now. It was not about what had happened. It was about what would follow. And as the night deepened, the silence of the room holding steady around them, Claire realized that she was no longer waiting for things to happen. She was part of what would happen next. The quiet certainty in his last words did not fade. It settled, anchoring itself into the space around them like something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. And Claire Bennett stood near the window now, her gaze no longer drifting outward but reflecting inward, the city lights blurring softly against the glass as her thoughts moved with a clarity she had not expected to find so quickly, because everything that had unfolded since she stepped outside that restaurant had forced her into a rhythm she had never practiced, one that demanded attention, demanded instinct, demanded that she trust the part of herself that noticed what others ignored. Adrian Vale remained still for a moment longer, his presence quiet but unmistakable, the kind of stillness that did not come from hesitation but from control. And when he finally turned from the window, there was a shift in the way he carried himself, subtle but defined, as if something within him had already moved past analysis and into decision. "We do not wait for confirmation," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying a finality that made the words feel less like a suggestion and more like a direction already in motion. And Claire turned slightly, her attention sharpening again as she followed the line of his thinking without needing it explained. "Because by the time it is confirmed, they will have adjusted," she said, her tone calm, her posture steady, and Adrian gave a slight nod, acknowledging the alignment without comment. The space between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt deliberate, like two paths that had converged not by accident, but by necessity. A soft vibration from the table broke the stillness again, and Adrian crossed the room with measured steps, his attention shifting immediately to the device as he picked it up, his eyes scanning quickly, absorbing information in a way that made it clear this was not new to him, that this pace, this precision, was something he had lived with for a long time. "Marcus has narrowed the access window," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now but carrying a deeper focus. And Claire moved closer without thinking, her presence no longer tentative, her curiosity no longer restrained. "To how many?" she asked, her voice steady, and Adrian glanced up briefly before answering. "3, he said, and the number hung in the air with a weight that was both specific and incomplete, because 3 was small enough to matter, but large enough to complicate everything. Claire nodded slowly, her mind already moving through the implications, her thoughts aligning into something sharper. "Then the next step is not to choose one," she said, her gaze steady on his. "It is to see which one expects you to react." Adrian's expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of the angle she was taking, and he set the device down again with quiet precision, his attention returning fully to her. "Explain," he said, not dismissing, not questioning, but inviting her to continue. And Claire took a slow breath, grounding herself in the logic she had begun to trust. "If this was planned from inside, then they are watching what happens next," she said, her voice calm, each word placed carefully. "They are waiting to see how you respond, how quickly, how directly." Adrian's gaze did not waver, and she continued, her confidence building with each step forward. "So whichever one reacts to your movement, whichever one adjusts their behavior when you do, that is the one who matters," she finished, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was focused, as if the idea itself had narrowed the room around them. Adrian exhaled slowly, a subtle shift that carried more weight than any immediate response, and he moved a step closer, the distance between them shrinking again, not in tension, but in alignment. "Then we give them something to react to," he said, his voice low, controlled, and Claire felt a small, steady certainty settle into place, because that was the answer she had been moving toward without fully naming it. "Yes," she said quietly, her gaze steady, "but it has to be real enough that they believe it." Adrian's expression held for a moment, and then he gave a slight nod, the decision already forming, already moving beyond the idea into action. "It will be," he replied, and the confidence in his tone did not feel forced. It felt practiced, earned, the kind of certainty that came from understanding not just the situation, but the people within it. The sound of footsteps approached again, and Marcus returned, his presence steady, his expression focused, the quiet urgency still present, but now shaped into something more controlled, more directed. "We have the profiles," Marcus said, holding the tablet forward, and Adrian took it without hesitation, his eyes moving quickly over the information as Claire stepped closer, her attention drawn to the screen. 3 names, 3 roles, 3 positions within a structure she was only beginning to understand, and yet even without knowing them, she could see the pattern, the way access and proximity overlapped, the way opportunity aligned with timing. "They all have clearance," Marcus continued, his voice low, "but their responsibilities differ, which means their ability to act would also differ." Adrian nodded once, his attention still on the screen, and Claire leaned in slightly, her gaze narrowing as she studied the details, searching not for something obvious, but for something that did not fit. "This one," she said after a moment, her finger hovering just above the screen without touching it, indicating one of the names. "He would not need to be near the network physically. His role gives him remote access." Adrian's gaze shifted to the point she indicated, and Marcus nodded slightly in agreement. "Correct," Marcus said, "which means his involvement would not require proximity." Claire's eyes moved to the next name, her thoughts continuing to align. "And this one," she added, "his position keeps him visible. Too many people would notice if he changed his behavior suddenly." Adrian's expression remained controlled, but something in it sharpened again, the pattern becoming clearer with each observation. "Which leaves the third," he said quietly, and Claire's gaze settled there, the final piece of the immediate puzzle, the one that fit without forcing it. "He has access," she said, her voice steady. "He has mobility, and he can observe without drawing attention." The room seemed to narrow around that conclusion, not closing in, but focusing, tightening into a single point of direction, and Adrian lowered the device slowly, his gaze lifting to meet hers again, the alignment between them now unmistakable. "Then we begin with him," he said, and Claire nodded once, the decision settling into place without hesitation, without doubt. And as Marcus stepped back to initiate the next phase, the quiet structure of the room shifting once more into motion, Claire realized that what had begun as a moment of instinct had become something far more deliberate, something that required not just awareness, but choice, and she had already made hers. The city beyond the glass continued its distant rhythm, unchanged, unaware, but inside this space, the direction was no longer uncertain. It was set, and they were already moving toward it. The decision settled into motion without noise, without urgency, but with a quiet precision that made everything feel sharper, more deliberate, and Claire Bennett stood beside the table as Marcus moved to execute the next step, the faint glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes as she watched the name they had narrowed down take on weight. No longer just one of 3 possibilities, but the center of something that had been hidden beneath layers of control. Adrian Vale did not rush, did not issue a string of commands. He simply adjusted the direction with a few quiet instructions that carried more authority than raised voices ever could. And Claire felt the difference in the way the room responded, the way unseen systems aligned themselves to his decisions as if they had been waiting for them. "We make the move visible," Adrian said, his voice low, steady, as he turned slightly toward Marcus. "Not enough to expose intent, but enough to create reaction." Marcus nodded once, already understanding, already moving to translate that into action, and Claire watched the exchange with a growing sense of clarity, because she could see now how everything connected, how each step was not isolated but part of a larger rhythm that depended on timing as much as logic. "What kind of move?" she asked, her voice steady, not interrupting but stepping into the process without hesitation, and Adrian's gaze shifted to her again, not dismissive, not surprised, but attentive in a way that made it clear her question mattered. "Something routine," he said, "something expected, but slightly altered." Claire considered that for a moment, her mind already moving to fill in the gaps, and she nodded slowly. "Enough to be noticed by someone watching closely," she said, her tone thoughtful, and Adrian gave a slight nod in return. "Exactly," he replied, and the simplicity of the agreement carried more weight than a longer explanation could have. Marcus returned a moment later, his posture composed, His focus sharpened into something precise. "We can schedule a movement within the hour," he said, a standard transition between divisions, one that would not raise concern on its own. Adrian did not hesitate. "Do it," he said, and the command was quiet but absolute. Claire felt the shift immediately, not in the room itself, but in the way everything seemed to align around that single decision, and she stepped slightly closer, her attention fully anchored now, no longer divided between understanding and reacting, but moving forward with purpose. "If they are watching, they will not respond immediately," she said, her voice calm. "They will wait to see if the change is consistent, if it repeats." Adrian looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression softened just enough to register, not as emotion, but as acknowledgement of the way she was thinking. "Then we give them consistency," he said, and Claire nodded, the pattern forming more clearly with each step. "And variation," she added, her eyes steady. "Small changes that only someone paying attention would notice." Adrian held her gaze for a fraction longer, and then gave a slight nod, the agreement quiet but complete. "Yes," he said, and the word carried a quiet finality, as if the plan had already begun to take shape beyond what was spoken. The room settled again, but it was not still, it was active beneath the surface. Every element moving in coordination with the direction that had been set, and Claire found herself standing more comfortably now, her presence no longer uncertain, her thoughts no longer scattered. She was part of the rhythm now, part of the movement that had replaced hesitation with intent. "You are adapting quickly," Adrian said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less formal, and Claire glanced at him briefly before answering, her expression thoughtful. "I do not have another choice," she said, and there was no self-doubt in the words, only truth, and Adrian watched her for a moment longer, something unreadable passing through his expression before it settled back into control. "Most people would not see it that way," he said, and Claire exhaled softly, her gaze drifting for a second toward the window before returning to him. "Most people are not here," she replied, and the simplicity of it held more meaning than she intended, because it was not just about the situation, it was about the fact that she had not stepped away, had not asked to leave, had not tried to return to what had been before. She had stayed. Adrian did not respond immediately, but the silence between them felt different now, less guarded, less distant, and for a brief moment, the space they shared felt less like a divide and more like something balanced, something held in place by mutual understanding rather than uncertainty. The sound of movement from the hallway signaled Marcus's return, and he approached with the same controlled urgency as before. "The schedule is set," he said, his voice low. "The first movement will occur within 15 minutes, and we will monitor all access points for reaction." Adrian nodded once, his attention sharpening again, the shift immediate, seamless. "Keep it contained," he said, "no unnecessary exposure." Marcus inclined his head slightly and stepped back again, the plan already in motion, and Claire felt the weight of the next few minutes settle into place, not heavy, but precise, like the ticking of something that could not be paused once it began. She glanced briefly at the device on the table, then back to Adrian, her voice quieter now, but steady. "If they respond, what happens next?" she asked, and Adrian met her gaze without hesitation. "Then we follow the response," he said, his tone calm, but carrying a deeper certainty. "And we let it lead us where they do not expect." Claire nodded slowly, the answer fitting into the pattern she had begun to understand, and as the seconds moved forward, the room seemed to narrow around that shared focus, everything aligning toward a single point of observation. The city beyond the glass remained unchanged, distant lights stretching endlessly into the night. Unaware of the shift taking place within these walls, and Claire stood still for a moment, her breathing steady, her thoughts clear, her presence anchored in a way that would have felt impossible just hours ago. Adrian moved closer to the window again, his posture composed, his gaze fixed outward but focused inward, and for a brief moment, Claire saw not just the man who controlled everything around him, but the weight of the world he carried, the constant awareness, the quiet readiness that never truly faded. "It begins now," he said, his voice low, and Claire felt the words settle into place, not as a warning, not as a question, but as a simple truth. And as the first step of the plan moved forward, unseen but undeniable, She realized that whatever came next would not be something she observed from a distance. She would be part of it, every second, every decision, every shift, moving alongside a man whose world had no room for hesitation, and trusting that the path they were following would lead them exactly where it needed to go. The first shift came so quietly it could have been missed by anyone not watching for it. But inside the room, nothing was missed, and Claire Bennett felt the exact moment the pattern changed, not through sound or movement, but through the subtle tightening in the air, the way Adrian Vale's attention sharpened without warning, his gaze lowering briefly to the device in his hand, as if something unseen had just aligned. "There," he said softly, and the word was not loud, but it carried enough weight to draw her focus immediately, her body responding before her mind could fully catch up as she stepped closer, her eyes searching his expression first, then the screen. Marcus appeared at the same moment, as if he had been waiting just beyond the threshold for this exact signal, his posture composed, but his attention locked with precision. "We have a deviation," Marcus said, his voice controlled, but there was a subtle edge beneath it now, something closer to confirmation than possibility. Adrian did not look away from the screen as he spoke. "Which one?" he asked, and Marcus moved closer, angling his own device so the data aligned between them, the quiet glow reflecting across both of their faces. "The third profile," Marcus said. He altered his access pattern 2 minutes after the movement was logged. Claire felt the shift instantly, the connection forming without hesitation, because this was what they had been waiting for, not a direct move, not something obvious, but a reaction, a change in rhythm that did not match the system's normal flow. "He noticed," she said quietly, her voice steady, and Adrian gave a slight nod, his attention still fixed on the screen as he followed the details. "He did," Adrian replied, and he adjusted. Claire leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the information. Even though much of it was unfamiliar, she could see the difference, the pattern breaking just enough to reveal intention beneath it. "But he did not stop," she added, her voice thoughtful now. "He continued, just differently." Marcus nodded once in agreement. "He maintained activity to avoid drawing attention," Marcus said. "But the sequence changed, the timing is off." Adrian exhaled slowly, a subtle shift that carried more weight than any visible reaction, and he set the device down with quiet precision, his gaze lifting to meet Claire's for a brief moment. "That is not caution," he said, his voice low. "That is control." Claire held his gaze, understanding settling into place with clarity that no longer felt uncertain. "He is not reacting out of fear," she said. "He is reacting because he knows what he is doing." Adrian gave a slight nod, the confirmation quiet, but absolute. "Yes," he said, and the single word carried the weight of everything that had just aligned. The room seemed to narrow around that realization, not closing in, but focusing, every element now directed toward a single point, and Claire felt her heartbeat steady instead of quicken, the clarity of the moment replacing the uncertainty that had defined the beginning of the night. "Then we move now," she said, her voice calm, and Adrian's gaze remained on her for a fraction longer before he responded. "Not yet," he said, his tone controlled. "If we move too quickly, we confirm what he suspects." Claire considered that, her mind adjusting immediately, and she nodded slowly. "Then we let him believe he is still ahead," she said, her voice quieter now, more precise, and Adrian's expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of the direction she was taking. "Yes," he said, "we allow the pattern to continue just long enough." Marcus stepped forward again, his focus sharpened further now that the target had been identified. "We can monitor his next access point," Marcus said. "Track where the deviation leads." Adrian nodded once. "Do it," he said, and the command was simple, but it carried a finality that made the next step inevitable. Claire stepped back slightly, giving them space, but her attention did not waver, her thoughts still moving in alignment with what was unfolding. And for the first time since the night began, she felt something else settle beneath the focus, something quieter, something more personal. She glanced toward Adrian, watching the way he moved, the way he absorbed information without hesitation, the way his presence held the room without effort, and she realized that what she had seen earlier, the control, the distance, the quiet authority, was only part of it. Beneath it was something else, something shaped by experience, by repetition, by a world where moments like this were not rare, but expected. You already suspected him, she said after a moment, her voice soft but steady, and Adrian did not look away from the device as he answered. I suspected the position, he said, not the person. Claire nodded slowly, understanding the distinction, and she stepped closer again, her presence no longer uncertain, no longer hesitant. And now? She asked, her gaze steady on him, and Adrian finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a clarity that did not leave room for doubt. Now we confirm, he said, and the certainty in his voice settled into the room like something permanent. The silence that followed was not empty. It was focused, every second carrying meaning as Marcus continued to track the movement, the data shifting in real time, the pattern unfolding in ways that could not be reversed once seen. Claire watched the screen again, the numbers, the sequences, the small changes that revealed intention beneath structure, and she felt the weight of it in a way that was no longer overwhelming, but grounding, because this was no longer chaos. It was direction. Adrian moved slightly, stepping closer to the table again, his posture unchanged, his focus absolute, and for a brief moment, Claire saw the reflection of the city in the glass behind him, the distant lights stretching endlessly into the night, and she understood the contrast more clearly than before. Out there, everything continued as if nothing had changed. In here, everything had. He is moving again, Marcus said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet with controlled urgency, and both Claire and Adrian turned immediately, their attention locking onto the screen as the next shift appeared. He is rerouting access through a secondary node, Marcus continued, trying to mask the deviation. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened further, the final piece falling into place. Then he knows we are close, Adrian said quietly, and Claire felt a small, steady certainty settle in her chest. Not fear, not hesitation, but something else entirely. Which means he will make a mistake, she said, her voice calm, and Adrian looked at her for a moment longer before giving a slight nod. Yes, he replied, and the word carried a quiet finality, because in a system built on control, even the smallest break in pattern could not be undone once it had been seen. And as the data continued to shift, the pattern revealing itself more clearly with every second, Claire realized that they were no longer searching for the truth. They were watching it unfold in real time, and there was no turning back from what came next. The moment the pattern broke again, it did not feel sudden. It felt inevitable, like something that had been building beneath the surface had finally reached the point where it could no longer remain hidden, and Claire Bennett stood close enough to see it unfold in real time, her eyes fixed on the shifting data as Marcus tracked each movement with quiet precision, the lines of access bending just slightly off their expected course, revealing intent where there had once been structure. He is accelerating, Marcus said, his voice controlled but edged with a deeper urgency now, and Adrian Vale did not respond immediately, his gaze locked onto the screen as if measuring not just what was happening, but what would come next. Claire felt it too, the subtle change in rhythm, the way the movements were no longer cautious, no longer controlled in the same careful pattern, but beginning to shift faster, tighter, as if the person behind them understood that time was no longer on their side. He knows, Claire said quietly, her voice steady, not alarmed but certain, and Adrian gave a slight nod, the confirmation silent but absolute. Yes, he replied, and he is trying to stay ahead of it. Claire leaned in slightly, her focus narrowing, her mind moving quickly through the possibilities, and she shook her head once, almost imperceptibly. No, she said, her tone thoughtful. He is not staying ahead. He is trying to create distance. Adrian's gaze shifted to her, sharper now, more focused, and for a brief moment the room seemed to tighten around that single distinction. Explain, Adrian said, his voice low, and Claire did not hesitate. If he was trying to stay ahead, he would maintain control, keep the pattern steady, she said, her words forming clearly. But this is different. He is moving faster, changing routes, shifting access points. That is not control, that is retreat. The silence that followed was not empty. It was precise, as if every word she had spoken had narrowed the situation further, and Adrian exhaled slowly, the the subtle shift carrying more weight than any visible reaction. Then he is preparing to disappear, Adrian said quietly, and Claire nodded once, the conclusion settling firmly into place. Yes, she said. And if he disappears, we lose the connection. Marcus stepped closer, his attention fixed on the screen, his posture steady but more focused than before. We can isolate the node he is moving toward, Marcus said. But if he completes the transition, the trail will fragment. Adrian's expression remained controlled, but something beneath it sharpened, something that spoke of timing, of precision, of knowing exactly how much space they had before the window closed. Then we do not let him complete it, Adrian said, his voice calm, but carrying a deeper finality now. And Claire felt the shift immediately, the movement from observation into action settling into place without hesitation. But if we stop him directly, he will know we are there, Claire said, her voice steady, and Adrian turned slightly toward her, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than before. He already knows, Adrian replied. The difference now is whether we control what he sees. Next, Claire held his gaze, the meaning clear, and she nodded slowly, her thoughts aligning with his without resistance. Then we guide him, she said, her voice quieter now, but certain, and Adrian's expression shifted again, not in surprise, but in recognition. Yes, he said. We give him a path that looks like escape. Marcus moved immediately, his fingers moving across the screen with controlled precision, adjusting access points, redirecting signals in ways that Claire could not fully understand but could feel, the system responding not with resistance, but with quiet compliance. We are opening a secondary route, Marcus said, his voice low. It will appear unguarded. Adrian nodded once. Make it believable, he said, and the command was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that depended on it. Claire stepped back slightly, her eyes still fixed on the screen, her breathing steady, her thoughts clear, and she watched as the pattern shifted again, not chaotic, not uncontrolled, but guided, shaped into something that looked natural, something that would draw attention without revealing intention. He is taking it, Marcus said after a moment, his voice quieter now, more focused, and Claire felt the confirmation settle into place, the plan moving forward exactly as intended. Adrian did not move, did not speak immediately, his attention fixed on the screen as the data aligned, the path narrowing, the connection strengthening instead of fading. He believes it, Claire said softly, and Adrian's response came without hesitation. He does, he said, and the certainty in his voice carried a quiet intensity that filled the room. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, every second carrying weight as the system continued to respond, the pattern unfolding in real time, the path tightening into something that could no longer be avoided. Claire stood still, her presence grounded, her focus unwavering, and for a moment she felt something shift again, not in the room, but within herself, a quiet understanding that this was no longer about following someone else's lead. This was about standing within the movement, within the decisions, within the space where everything mattered. What happens when he reaches the end of the path? She asked, her voice steady, and Adrian looked at her, his gaze holding hers with a clarity that did not leave room for doubt. Then he reveals himself, Adrian said, and the words settled into place with quiet finality, because there was no other outcome, no other direction this could take once the path was complete. Claire nodded slowly, the understanding clear, and she turned her attention back to the screen, watching as the final sequence began to align, the movement narrowing, the connection strengthening, the distance closing instead of widening. Marcus remained focused, his posture steady, his attention absolute, and Adrian stood beside him, his presence calm, controlled, certain, and for a brief moment, Claire saw the reflection of all three of them in the glass beyond, their positions aligned in a way that felt almost inevitable. The city outside continued its distant rhythm, unchanged, unaware, but inside this space, everything had shifted, everything had narrowed, everything was moving toward a single point of revelation. And as the final seconds began to unfold, Claire realized that they were no longer searching for the person behind it all. They were about to see them. The final shift did not come with noise or urgency. It came with clarity, a quiet, undeniable alignment that settled into the room as Marcus's screen stabilized, the moving data resolving into a single, fixed point, and Claire Bennett felt it before she fully understood it. The subtle stillness that followed motion, the way the air seemed to hold its breath as if something long concealed had finally stepped into the light. "He is there," Marcus said, his voice low, no longer edged with urgency, but grounded in confirmation. And Adrian Vale did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the screen with a focus that felt absolute, as if every detail mattered now, every second, every movement, every choice that had led to this exact moment. Claire stepped closer, her presence steady, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the coordinates, the access point, the digital trace that was no longer shifting, no longer hiding, but present, undeniable. And for a moment, the simplicity of it felt almost surreal, because after everything, after all the layers and misdirection and careful movement, it had come down to this. "He stopped running," Claire said softly, her voice steady, and Adrian's reply came just as quietly. "No," he said. He reached where he intended to go. The distinction settled instantly, sharper than before, and Claire felt it in the way her thoughts aligned, because this was not retreat, this was arrival, a planned endpoint, a place chosen with purpose, and that realization carried a different kind of weight. "Then this is not just a hiding place," she said, her gaze lifting briefly to meet his. "It is part of the plan." Adrian held her gaze for a moment longer, something deeper passing through his expression, not surprise, not doubt, but recognition, and then he nodded once, the confirmation quiet but complete. "Yes," he said, and the word felt like the final piece falling into place. Marcus adjusted the screen slightly, expanding the view, revealing more than just the access point, showing the surrounding structure, the layers of connection that extended outward, and Claire leaned in slightly, her focus sharpening again as she followed the lines, the relationships, the way everything linked together beneath the surface. "This is not isolated," she said, her voice thoughtful, and Marcus nodded in agreement. "It is embedded within a larger system," Marcus said, "one that connects multiple internal routes." Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his gaze deepened, the implications settling quickly, precisely. "Then this was never just about one move," Adrian said quietly. "It was about creating access." Claire felt a small, steady chill at that, not from fear, but from understanding, because access meant continuation, meant something beyond the single moment they had just traced, something that extended further than they had initially seen. "And now that we have found it," she said slowly, "we are part of that access." Adrian turned his attention fully to her then, his gaze steady, unwavering, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow around them, the rest of the world fading into something distant and secondary. "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else he could have said. Claire held his gaze, the meaning clear, the consequence undeniable, and she nodded once, not because she was accepting it, but because she already had. The silence that followed was not empty, it was complete, everything that needed to be understood already in place, every piece aligned, every question answered in the way it needed to be, and Marcus stepped back slightly, giving them space, his role shifting from discovery to readiness. "We can move on the location," Marcus said, his voice controlled, "or we can continue to observe and gather more." Adrian did not hesitate. "We do not give him time to rebuild," he said, his tone calm but final, and Claire felt the certainty in it, the shift from analysis to action settling fully into place. She glanced once more at the screen, at the fixed point that had once been hidden, and then back to Adrian, her voice quieter now, but no less steady. "Then this ends," she said, and Adrian's gaze held hers, something softer moving beneath the control, something that had not been there at the beginning of the night. "This part does," he replied, and the distinction was clear, because nothing about this felt like an ending. It felt like a turning point, a moment where one path closed and another began. Claire exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing just slightly, not from relief, but from the release of uncertainty, and she stepped back half a step, giving him space, though her attention did not waver. Adrian moved toward the window once more, the city stretching out before him, endless, distant, unchanged, and for a moment, he stood there in silence, his posture composed, his presence steady, as if measuring something beyond what could be seen. Then he turned back, his gaze finding Claire again, and there was something different in it now, something that had shifted quietly over the course of the night, not in intensity, but in meaning. "You should not have been part of this," he said, his voice low, not distant, not dismissive, but reflective, in a way that carried more weight than it should, and Claire met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, her voice steady. "But I am," she said, and the truth of it settled between them without resistance. Adrian studied her for a moment longer, something unreadable passing through his expression before it softened just slightly, not enough to change who he was, but enough to reveal that something had changed nonetheless. "You saw what others missed," he said, "and you stayed when others would have left." Claire did not look away, her presence grounded, her voice quiet but certain. "I did what needed to be done," she replied, and Adrian nodded once, the acknowledgement simple but complete. The room seemed to settle around them, the urgency easing into something steadier, something resolved, and Marcus stepped forward again, ready for the next command, the next movement, the next step that would carry this forward beyond the walls of this room. Adrian did not look away from Claire as he spoke. "We move," he said, and the words carried the same quiet authority as before, but now there was something else beneath them, something unspoken, something that had formed not through strategy, but through shared experience. Claire nodded once, her breath steady, her thoughts clear, and as the moment shifted from stillness into motion, she realized that the path she had stepped onto without warning had not only changed the outcome of a single night. It had changed the direction of everything that came after. And somewhere between the moment she pulled him back and the moment they stood here now, something else had taken shape, something quieter, something unspoken, something that neither of them needed to name to understand. Some lives change in an instant. Others begin in one.